Agriculture, organized by the Inter-Academy Partnership and ISAC, the European body of the Inter-Academy Partnership conglomerate. Our introductory speaker will be Volker Termoil. Volker is the past president of the National Academy of Science, the Leopoldina in Germany. He was president of ISAC, and he is co-chairing the Inter-Academy Partnership. So Volker is a giant in the field of science academy leadership. His background is virology, infectiology, medicine. He's from the University of Würzburg. Volker, without any further ado, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank first the organizers for giving us the opportunity as IAP to be here today and to present a project of food and nutrition security, which is a project we started 2 years ago. But before I come and give you some introduction to the structure of this project and how do we approach it, let me just introduce to you and explain to you what is the Inter-Academy Partnership, which was mentioned this morning already in the session by our chairman, and which is actually the structure which is organizing and handling the project. Okay, here you now see an organigram, and the organigram summarizes the structure of the Inter-Academy Partnership. You see on the bottom line that we have over 130 member academies of sciences and medicine, and they are distributed globally all over the world. But we have areas, for example, the Middle East, where we have very few or none of academies, and there we have an area which actually should be filled, because we all realize how important science is in these days. And since the science academies are an organization in which they pick the best and highest educated and well-known scientists as their members, it is good to have this group of member academies, which is actually the support for us for the Inter-Academy Partnership. And above you see 4 red boxes. And you see there Asia, Europe, Americas, and Africa. And in each of these continents, regional networks have been created by the academies which are in these countries. And these regional academies function on their own, and they pick their topic and deal with this topic depending on the situation where they are located. And these networks are affiliated with the Inter-Academy Partnership, and this is actually the structure we depend on if we want to do something together globally on projects like our food and nutrition security. And above you see 3 green boxes, and you see health, science, and research reports. And these are formerly global networks which independently were created, which independently were working, and which has certain topics. Health is obvious, medicine, public health. Science is the entire area of science, and research and reports is a small group which is elected out of the science, which is handling reports. For example, if United Nations has a particular question to our network, then they pick up this topic and work on it. And all these groups I mentioned have been put together last year into the Inter-Academy Partnership for the simple reason that it is very important that we realize we have to make use of the broad knowledge and not only divide ourselves in regional networks and they work independently. Let's try to do this together. And this is the reason why we started, a new project. Now let me just mention the strategic objects and aims we have of IAP. Number 1 is, of course, we want to give science-based policy advice from the global network. We all realize that in these days science is a basis for many discussions in Parliament, and many discussions taking place in Parliament do have a science background. And it is therefore very important that our politicians are aware of a scientific basis for their decisions, for the reason that we think this is something not only for where I come from Europe, where the European Commission and European Union needs this advice. This is needed everywhere. And this is one of our main, actually, activity we have in IAP. The second is we wanted to strengthen the global scientific enterprise. We want to champion science education to work towards a scientific literal global citizenry. This is something which has been started from the very beginning in IAP. And the IAP Science was founded in 1993, and ever since they have programs running everywhere in the developing countries to educate, to present science to society and to children. And we would also, what we are doing, try to develop and strengthen the global network of science academies. In other words, create new activities, help. And when, for example, we look back 17 years ago, in Africa, only 8 or 9 academies were existing. In the meantime, we have 24. And that so many academies have been created in Africa is something which is so nice to see. It is so important for the particular nation in question, but it is also due to the fact that IAP has helped tremendously with structure, financial support, etc. So now let's go and talk about food and nutrition security. We were founded as the Inter-Academy Partnership 1.5 years ago. The discussion started already 2-3 years ago, and it was obvious if we wanted to exercise an analysis of important questions, which is important globally and important to all societies, we should pick a topic which would fulfill this criteria, number one. And in the discussion we had from the developing countries, the suggestion was brought to us, let's start to do food and nutrition security in agriculture as a topic. This topic in itself, of course, is broad. There are different opinions worldwide. There are different experts which have different fields in which they are really knowledgeable. And if we would pick such a topic, it would bring to us the information which is present in the different continents on this issue. And the approach was taken from a scientific point of view. We wanted to ask, what can science actually do and help and to develop in this area? So we had 4 parallel regional expert working groups in Africa, Asia, Americas, and Europe to share evidence and learning and to tackle society priorities. And what we also did, we agreed on a common template. What we wanted to do is define 10 major topics, 10 major questions. And we would ask all these regional networks, please work on these 10 questions with about 15 or 20 subheadings and give answers to the questions we have agreed upon in the very beginning. This would lead to 4 independent reports on these 10 major topics. And to give you some example, I have picked here 4 different topics. What are the major challenges, opportunities for food and nutrition security in agriculture, future projections for the region? Another one is what are strengths and weaknesses of science and technology at national or regional level? Number 3, for example, what are the prospects for increasing efficiency of food system? What are the public health and nutrition issues, particularly with regard to impact of dietary change in food demand and health? I cannot list all the 10 with all the subtitles. This is just to give you an idea and a feeling for this activity. So this has been done in the last 2 years. We are now in the middle of the situation where we are ending the first phase, where we'll have 4 reports. They are very big reports, very intensive analysis. And when these 4 reports are available, and we hope in the next couple of months we have finished this and can publish this, we start with the 5th report. And the 5th report is the idea to look on these 4 reports and make a synthesis, describe the differences, describe the similarities, and come with recommendations for policy makers. Because in our days, I don't have to tell you, you're all aware of it, if you make a decision in one point of the globe, if the United Nations makes a decision, if the EU, for example, EU Commission makes a decision in Parliament, this has an effect on other countries outside Europe as well. So politicians have to be aware that this aspect of food and nutrition is something which has to be addressed globally. So, and the focus on this fifth report is altogether using present knowledge to promote innovation and equity and inform policy and practice, identify knowledge gaps to fill with new research, and mobilizing scientific resources. And what will follow now is the colleagues from the different areas which will tell you what they have seen and what they have observed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Volker. Thank you very much. Colleagues, when you come to a conference like this, you want to hear something new. I can promise you, when you go home, you will not be able to say, I haven't heard anything new, because the presentations which you will listen to are not published. You have the opportunity to attend a so-called sneak preview of reports which are currently in the making. Furthermore, as this process which Volker has just laid out is in progress, you can still influence it with your questions and remarks. So that's also very important. We will have speakers from Africa, Asia, Americas, Europe, and first on Africa and his perspectives. I mean, these are not disassociated perspectives from the individual presenters. They give it their touch. They're not reading to you some report summaries. So Professor Endashaf Wodofar is from Addis Ababa University. His background is in biotech and genetics. He is a member of a number of academies of sciences. He is an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellow. Endashaf, I think I need to give you technical assistance.
Please do so. Okay.
Speakers are instructed 8 minutes.
Good morning. First of all, I'm very much delighted to get this opportunity of presenting. As Professor Joshim has already indicated, I'm not trying to give a summary of the report, but I give my observation of the report and some of the understanding that I have in terms of now, I think food insecurity, whether it is in terms of food as food and nutrition, has got so many variables. That is the reason why it is transboundary, transdisciplinary. But I will focus only on science education aspect of the food security system. Now, to do that, I will pose a question that the world is taking only predominantly few number of crops out of 3,000 plants that are used and 20 crops that exist in the world. Such minimal resources are of great danger and risk because of the genetic vulnerability and being unsustainable in many aspects. Africa, like most of the continent, accommodates a large number of underutilized crops, diverse use of wild plants. Of course, it is the scene of major events of human evolution and human civilization. So the diverse indigenous knowledge that exists in Africa, the diverse underutilized crops that exist in Africa must be promoted, must be domesticated in order to really bring sustainability of food at the world scale. There are also ecosystem definition differences in terms of our understanding of agriculture. Agriculture is, of course, an integral part of both physical and social environment that is very distinct. You have got generalized natural ecosystem of agriculture, you have got specialized ecosystem of agriculture, and what is generalized, what is specialized, and what is the dynamic that exists is also underestimated in terms of our approach to bring productivity. The components that make food nutrition security and its subsystems function are trained and responsible manpower, access to information, access to technology, evaluation of the progress, and of course financial resources and well-versed leadership at institutional level. Well-versed professional leadership at institutional level. I make a distinction between political leadership and professional leadership. If the two could combine, I love that, but in most cases that is not true. The African science and technology landscape has got so many variables as a pitfall. Low investment in science and technology, declining quality of science and technology education, brain drain and brain wastage, acquisition of outdated infrastructure, and local and continental limitations. And of course, the three critical capacities needed for research and development in the African countries, whether it is in terms of science and technology, food and nutrition studies, is the human capacity, the institutional capacity, and infrastructural capacity. So in reviewing, except South Africa in most cases, and some of the newly emerging countries, I think we have got serious problem with reference to this. Capacity differences exist in the world. There are areas with little research capacity in most fields. There are attracting areas with highly sophisticated research activities. And the position of Africa is quite clear. And unless we tackle this particular problem, then we cannot talk about food and nutrition security in the continent. Change in agriculture is needed for the future climate change in particular, because of local warming, higher atmospheric carbon, high temperature. But I argue that globally underutilized crops, the 2,000 utilized crops in Africa and other crops also in Asia and other countries, contribute to such changes in agriculture in order to mitigate climate change. So to tackle climate change with existing crops is not sustainable. One has to expand the food base. Integrated variable to mitigate food security, again, the social global issues, utilization and continuation of the process of domestication. Domestication started 11,000 years ago. There are still many crops, many wild plants that has to be domesticated and expand the food base. Particularly in terms of the science that exists, the genomic science that exists, that can be speeded up. But to speed up, we need different forms of collaboration. We need strategic alliance, we need technological cooperation, we need strategic partnership, strategic technology partnership, and technology partnership. All these share technology capabilities. So for Africa, then strategically it has to cooperate with the leading nation, but that cooperation has to be in terms of promoting the underutilized crops and enhance the domestication process, not only for Africa, but for the global food sustenance. And of course, genomics becomes extremely very important in this particular aspect. So to promote and apply the missing and underdeveloped science and technology-based methods in food and nutrition studies also becomes extremely very important. I was given the task to review the science and the technology that are not promoted in order to enhance food and nutrition security by Professor Hassan in our deliberation with the groups that are working. And in fact, when one looks into the literature, green and blue, water science and technology, X-ray based technologies for soil mineralogy, recent development in novel shelf life extension and technologies. But then I asked myself, are there people in Africa in the right number, in the right mix? The answer is no. And therefore I argue, unless that particular aspect is dealt with, then the food and nutrition problem mitigation in the African setting becomes extremely very slim. Genetic vulnerability of modern crops versus food security is also another very important issue, because the modern crops are genetically vulnerable. Climate is changing. The agricultural dynamics has been lost. The large number of species that exist in the traditional agricultural system are not taken in terms of promoting productivity. And therefore, the science demand of agricultural productivity in the future becomes even more demandful. And that is where transboundary and transdisciplinary must be promoted. So Africa's commitments is quite large. In the morning also we learned a lot in sustainable developmental goal, transformation of agriculture. But this commitment has to be meaningfully implemented by professional and with political commitment that is needed. So it is not the problem of not having policy. Of course, policies have to be revisited with the new technological input. But nevertheless, I think implementation is very slow, very slim, unprofessional in most cases. And this is, of course, what science academies are supposed to advise. So review of national policies required. I'm finishing. Policies required, and this strongly begs for policy direction and advice document, which we are working on. I'm definitely sure when we come, then it will be distributed, and I love to discuss that when question comes. Thank you.
Let's fill up. Watch the screen from there. Get right next to me there. Thank you. Thank you for underlining key issues of the African research agenda, and obviously productivity, sustainability of production, availability of food still is a major issue in Africa, given its fast-growing population and the current deficits and the large import needs of Africa, which is very different from the next region we are turning to. Eduardo Bianchi is professor at the University of Argentina de Negocios. He's an economist. He had high-level positions in government, was Secretary of Industry and Trade will be one of the buzzwords which we will revisit. Are you self-contained and can we need to close all this, yeah? Close this. Excellent. Please, you have the floor. And while you are looking, Argentina is president of G20 next year, and food and agriculture issues may be high on the agenda. From this region, Saudi Arabia is the G20 country. Maybe there are some connections which you can follow up after the session.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. Have the opportunity to present the work of Llanas for the YAP project that, sorry. Okay, here I am. That we call Food and Nutrition Security in the Americas, a view from the academies of science. Let me begin explaining what IANAS is, the Inter-American Network of Academies of Science. For this work, we could engage the academies of science of 21 countries of the America. We can involve 230 scientists and experts from different scientific fields. This is an experience that has no precedent in America, no? The involvement of such a quantity of scientists and experts. Each Academy of Science work on a country assessment from Canada in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south, a work that took us 2 years, and we also finished working in a summary of the key elements of these country reports. So as you can see, it's a very big cooperative effort among these numerous scientists and experts from the Americas. Let's begin shortly explaining what the America is. America is a whole continent. It goes from the Arctic in the north to the Antarctic in the south. We occupy 28% of land area of the Earth and 14% of world population. As you can see, it's a very, very heterogeneous region. We have big countries that coexist with very small countries. For example, in the Americas, we have Canada, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and also very small countries, for example, some Caribbean islands. So we have a lot of diversity. We have different climates, we have different topography, we have different agricultural practices, we have different economic development, and we have different science, technology, and innovation systems. Just in terms of economic development, you can see that it's very different, the United States and Canada, from Latin American countries. But as a region, we have an abundance of natural resources, water, arable land, energy, but it is unequal distributed among American countries. And we have these big countries like the US, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, that are big net food exporters. That's very important in our region. And we have also many net food importers. Big countries like Mexico or Venezuela that are net food importers, and also these small countries that are net food importers. You can see that, for example, the United States, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay concentrate a very large share of some agricultural products export, world export. For example, in soy and soy byproducts, wheat, corn, and meat. We represent a very huge share of world export, and that's very important for the region. We have also major challenges that are common to the other regions. For example, although there was a big progress in the last 15 years, we still have severe food insecurity in Latin America. We have 40 million people that are very food insecure, but that's because poverty continues to be important. Unlike another regions, there is not conflicts or wars in the Americas that is one of the main drivers of food insecurity nowadays. But we have poverty. Again, I'm sorry. In the case of Argentina, for example, just to give an example, we have 1.5 million people that is food insecure, but we have around 12 million of people that is in poverty. Then that would be the vulnerable population in terms of food insecurity. Well, the situation is very different between the US and Canada on one side and between Latin America and the Caribbean on the other side. We have also the coexistence of malnutrition, food insecurity, and obesity. In the case of obesity, we have an overlapping in the poor population of food insecurity and also obesity. You know that junk food is cheaper than nutritious food, and that's a very important issue in our countries. We have also environmental degradation, water and soil contamination, massive deforestation. That's important because in some of our countries, the forests are very, very important, not only for our countries, but for the world. For example, in the last years, the soy production has moved north in Argentina and Brazil. In the case of Argentina, we lost forest for an extension equal to an European country. You can see it's very, very big, the deforestation. And also in the case of Brazil, that soy is growing in the Amazon zone. We have also experiencing climate change. We have a drought, we have floods, and the Caribbean and the Central America countries are especially vulnerable to climate change. In terms of agricultural production, we have very different situation. Small producers coexist with sophisticated agricultural production chains. And so it's also very different situations. We know, and it becomes very clear for the countries and for the conclusion report, that science, technology, and innovation has a key role on all these issues. For example, how to increase productivity without environmental sustainability, how to integrate robotics and big data for more efficient management, how to use more efficiently water. We have abundance of water, but it is being degraded. How to improve the approaches to pests and diseases. We have, mainly in Latin American countries, some limited capacities in our research systems. For example, human resources are not enough, infrastructure is not enough, and financing is not enough. They are all elements that are needed. So we think that an intra-regional and international cooperation in these issues is needed. And we think that the agricultural research agenda on climate change in the case of the America is missing. We have a lot of work in mitigation, but we are very behind in adaptation. What's the way forward? And with this slide, I will finish. From the country reports, we have a very specific policy agenda for each country. We have, I'm sorry for that, I don't know how to use this. Thank you. I will put this here, not to go in. We have a specific policy agenda for each country, and for the summarizing report. We have also a specific policy agenda for the common problems in the continent. We think that we must have a cooperative approach to tackle with the importance of science, technology, and innovation for agriculture. Also, we see the relevance of overweight and obesity together with poverty. That's a very, very important problem. Let me say that, for example, we have a lot of poor youngers that don't work and they don't study, and their parents, and they didn't see their parents to work. So that's a very, very specific problem. That is the next line, the relationship between poverty and food and nutrition security. We think that here we have an access problem because there is a lot of food availability in the Americas, but the poverty issue is very important, and we must work on the labor market so that people can get work and income to pay for their food. And then we have the role of international trade and trade policies. You know that some of, as I told before, some of the main exporters of food are in the Americas. Their trade policies were not very good in the last years when the food prices went up. We have a lot of export restrictions, but we are willing, the Latin American countries mainly are willing to restore the confidence and trust in international trade to source food. No, we think that a lot of trade policies that we applied in the last years were not very good policies. So to finish, we have to improve the ability to feed and nourish ourselves in the Americas while making a substantial contribution to the full supply available to the rest of the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So, who feeds the world? It's the Americas. If you add up, Paul, could you come up? I don't find a cursor here anymore. Ah, here it is. Got it. Paul, would you come? Let me complete the sentence. If you add up the 4 crops, maize, rice, wheat, soy, which produce 80% plus of the world calories, it's the Americas who feed Asia, Europe, and Africa. I'm sorry, the computer seems to be dormant. Got it. Introduce our next speaker, Paul Morgan, all the way from New Zealand, probably the farthest traveled. Is professor at Massey University, director of a National Research Center of Excellence on Food and Nutrition Science. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. Our trip around the world hemispheres continues with Asia. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Joachim.
And before you start, colleagues, food security is important as a research agenda. Your lunch break is not. We will overrun into the lunch breaks by 15 minutes. I would also like to ask, so we will have time to listen to your questions. I also ask the panelists to stay in the room so that individual conversations will still be possible and you don't disappear too quickly. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Joachim. Ladies and gentlemen, the Asia-Pacific region, which our group has examined, faces a very formidable challenge over the next 20 to 30 years. In our analysis of the region, we described the Pacific as Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and Asia as the green coloured countries on the globe shown here. And I'd like to point out that the Middle East was very much part of the Asian Pacific analysis for world food security. The world population is growing exponentially, and if one looks at a breakdown in terms of Asia, much of that world growth will actually take place in countries within the Asian region. However, the growth will be variable, and one can see, for example, China is projected to decline in population between 2015 and 2050, whereas countries like India and Indonesia are projected to increase their populations in a major way. But already, as other speakers have pointed out, worldwide 850 odd million people suffer protein energy malnutrition, and some 2 billion people further suffer what is described as hidden hunger. Once again, the Asian area is not immune, and if we look at the IFPRI Hunger Index data, a score of 20 being serious undernutrition, there are countries in the region such as Pakistan, Tajikistan, Yemen and India that currently face very major issues in terms of global hunger, in terms of undernutrition. That's before the effects of this projected massive increase in population growth. I can report that for Jordan, the IFPRI Hunger Index for Jordan is in fact very low. So currently Jordan does not suffer this type or this degree of undernutrition. But in parts of Asia, we suffer severe undernutrition problems right now before projected population growth, which in some areas is going to be very great. But paradoxically at the same time, there's also an obesity epidemic worldwide. And if we look at overweightness in children, one can see a looming problem for the Asian region. Large proportions of our children in many of our countries are overweight. And unfortunately, when we look at Jordan, the proportion of overweightness in children is not a good statistic. In fact, very, very high. And I think a looming problem, a looming challenge for Jordan and other areas within Asia in the Middle East, where overweightness in children is high. The whole food security issue, of course, is exacerbated by climate change, and we face an uncertain future for food production. It's also exacerbated by biofuel production, which is very, very hard to predict into the future. But the more land area that's used to produce ethanol for fuel, of course, the less food will be available in the Asia-Pacific region. Well, what are the overall implications of these background driving factors? It believes that the world will need to produce something like 70% more food than today by the year 2050. Not just more food, but better food nutritionally. And that's why we stress in our reports not food security alone, but food and nutrition security. So more food, yes, but also better food. And that has major implications. The impact of food production on land, water and other resources, and the impact on climate change needs to be taken into account, and production needs to be sustainable. And bringing all that together, the threat of insufficient food and insufficient proper nutrition, we believe after conducting our report, really is a pressing current day problem for Asia-Pacific region. In terms of the approach we took, It's regional experts addressing regional problems. And I think these are unique aspects of the 4 reports. Experts drawn from wide geographical areas, so all areas represented, and across a great variety of science disciplines, so many inputs of different thoughts. We took a bottom-up analysis of food and nutrition security, synthesised the information using a food systems approach to develop common themes and recommendations. Also very important, we've had buy-in from all the science associations in the region, so there's backing and understanding right across the whole network of science in Asia Pacific. Where appropriate, we took a territorial approach, and we found that often the variation between sectors and areas and regions can be greater than across countries. So very, very important to look into parts of countries as to what is really going on. And of course, our final findings are aimed at regional and national government organisations and regional and national policy makers. And we really hope that our findings will be of use to those policy makers, policies will be driven through, and we can see changes into the future. What were the key findings of the group? Well, the future poses a significant challenge to our region. Both under and overnutrition are challenges. There's a need to address numerous non-technical factors that affect food security, but really speaking, science and technology must take centre stage if we're going to avoid problems going forward. Food and nutrition security is more than simple calorie provision. There's an urgent need, we believe, to define what is a healthy diet, and that will vary from country to country, region to region, cultural aspects, etc. But we need to define urgently and with acumen what we actually mean by healthy diets. Those are the diets we need to provide going forward. Food wastage is as important as food supply. We identified a number of countries that are really hotspots for food and nutrition security. They are India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Myanmar, the Philippines, Iraq, and the Yemen. And as a starting point, we advocate a systems analysis within those countries where there will be certainly severe problems, and from that systems analysis, pull together a blueprint for research. We would hope that that research could be funded across the region, something like a European Commission for Science funding, and be cross-national, cross-disciplinary. We need research, we need education if we're going to take on what is a huge looming problem. And so, Mr. Chairman, to conclude, and this is a quote taken from our Asia Pacific report, increasing pressures from population growth, urbanisation, land availability, resource and water availability, pollution, global climate change and loss of biodiversity conspire to make food and nutrition security a formidable near-term challenge. Science offers solutions, but plans need to be made now and enacted boldly and decisively if catastrophe and great suffering are to be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. I think the territorial approach is of high relevance for all countries. If you hammer harder on it. Okay. Not only for the, of course, big ones like China and India, but also for countries in this region, say Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt. Our last not least speaker is Robin Fears. Robin, you're director of the ESAC Bioscience program, closely involved with the European report in the making. You have a background in pharmaceutical industries from the UK. Your focus has been in health and in cardiovascular diseases, but you're a broad-based science policy advisor. You have the floor. Please, your 8 minutes.
Thank you, Joachim. And please let me add my thanks to the other speakers, to the organisers of this session, this conference, and our hosts. Okay, so ESAC, as many of you will know, is formed by the National Science Academies of the European Union and several other countries. For this project, we're representing slightly greater geographical region in Europe. So, for example, we also include European Russia. We have a history in ESAC of interest in a lot of the topics that we've been talking about this morning. I reiterate that our report is not yet published. It will be published at the end of this month. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is an impression and a summary of some of the themes rather than specific recommendations. I just want to mention 2 points in this slide. First, to reiterate what you already heard in the plenary session, that in Europe too we suffer from a number of problems of food and nutrition insecurity, particularly if you count in obesity as part of the definition of that. So, and I'll come back to that. And secondly, like my other speakers this morning, I'm focusing on the scientific opportunity that's present in these areas. This, is that focus? Sorry, I'll let someone else focus. This broadly is a conceptual framework that is described in our report. Okay, yeah. And overall, as again we heard in a number of the speakers, we're taking a food systems approach as defined by the IAP template questions that Volker Merlin introduced to you before. On this slide, we have some of the topics inherent within the food systems approach, ranging from agricultural productivity through to nutrition, understanding markets, as my co-speaker mentioned, and taking account of many of the cross-cutting issues, such as large data sets. I'll look at some of these points in a little bit more detail, but I emphasize the importance of taking an integrated approach that covers waste as well as production. And Vladimir Susha earlier today talked about the problems of food waste in Europe, for example. Okay, but agriculture is, of course, a significant part of the food systems. And in the ESAC report, as with the other reports, we cover quite a range of issues for improving agronomic practice, crop breeding, animal breeding, food from the ocean, and other aquaculture. A very broad approach, a lot of scientific advances, a lot of it increases in productivity over the last few years, but a great deal more needs to be done. I don't have time to cover very much of the individual points, but let me just mention in the context of the second bullet, the advances in basic research that are now accruing in genome editing that create a whole range of new opportunities coming within range for plant and animal breeding, more precise, more quickly, and more cheaply. But in Europe, we do have a challenge to ensure that the rate of regulatory oversight keeps pace with the fast rate of scientific advance. Okay, another major aspect within the food systems approach that Paul, for example, mentioned just down in the Asian context, is the pivotal central role of nutrition and the research agenda that, as we heard, it includes important issues for the social sciences, so, for example, understanding consumer behaviour, consumer choices of diet, and maybe informing and influencing those choices, but many other scientific advances, particularly in personalised nutrition and microbiomics. A number of speakers have talked about innovative foods and innovative diets, and particularly sustainable, healthy diets. But actually, we don't yet know how to define a sustainable, healthy diet, both in terms of its healthy dimensions and in terms of its sustainable dimensions. And when we look at the policy landscape, there is a concern that there may be some sort of disconnect or trade-off between the objectives required by COP in terms of climate change, its mitigation, and the other recommendations, for example, related to the SDGs for a healthy diet. And we see this in Europe, for example, with regard to recommendations to modulate meat and dairy production, and we go into that in our report. Coming to one of the other major cross-cutting issues in terms of the intersection with the environmental resources agenda, so water, biodiversity, energy, soil, a very broad agenda for natural resources. In Europe, we have a very complex regulatory landscape, not necessarily complete coherence between the different policy instruments, but clearly that there is a need to design a more integrated approach to ensure, as the first bullet says, that our continuing efforts to increase food systems efficiency, agricultural productivity, is not achieved at the expense of other environmental resources. We characterize soil in particular in the report, not just with regard to the problems of soil health, but capitalizing on the scientific opportunities with regard to the soil microbiome, for example. You can see our report with regard to more information on that. And of course, in that and other contexts, the bioeconomy is critically important. Agriculture is a major part of the bioeconomy in Europe and elsewhere, but there may be competing objectives and competing uses in the bioeconomy, for example, for bioenergy and for crops for food, that still need to be reconciled. My last couple of slides really try to distill some of the more strategic aspects of what we have produced in our research report. We emphasize the very important interface between nutrition sensitivity and environmental sustainability in order to address the food, energy, water nexus and other nexuses. We recognize that even in Europe, we are a heterogeneous group, but more even within individual countries, we are heterogeneous in terms of particular vulnerable populations, whether that's the elderly, patients, or others, migrants. And recommendations can't be generalized for national populations or regional populations, but we have to consider also the vulnerable populations. But having said that there are some generalizations. One is that large data sets remain a vital tool to analyze what we want to analyze and to share the information that we accrue. And finally, from this slide, in terms of the research agenda, we emphasize really the very critical role of basic research that drives all the other research advances. Without fundamental research, we do not reveal the new scientific opportunities. That has to be accompanied, of course, as we heard previously from Joachim, for research across the disciplines and for long-term commitment to research. Plant breeding, for example, takes a number of years to reach fruition. We need a long-term commitment to research. There's a lot more that academies can do in terms of following up what we've done. I think we have to be more ambitious in using the scientific opportunities. We have to speak to multiple audiences, as it says here, and those audiences include the public. And so there's a significant part of our follow-up, how best do we engage with the public. And just finally, Europe is a little bit different from the other regions that you've heard about. We do have long-established regional policy and political institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament. We also have a history of large regional R&D collaboration and R&D advisory mechanisms to policymakers. So we are relatively fortunate in all of those respects. But the point I want to finish with is that in addition to the focus that we've all given to our regions, there are, of course, a number of interregional issues, a number of global issues that will, as Volker said, be part of the next phase of this project. and some of these are just summarised here. The underpinning role of basic research, which I've already mentioned, but also there are inter-regional partnerships for R&D of great importance to us all. But there are also spillovers from individual regions onto other regions, and we're very conscious in Europe that our choices for food and choices of natural resources do have implications for our neighbours in the Mediterranean and the Middle East, for example. What Europe does affect other countries, both in terms of our choices and in terms of our policy decisions, which may well affect export markets. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Robin. Please settle down here. Colleagues, I will give us 10 minutes for your questions or comments. I will give you the microphone in a moment. And I think I just walk around. Please take notes. You will have only a minute or so of response time, and then we wrap it up and go for lunch. So let me start from the back. If you are really brief, we get 10 one-minute interventions in. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Saeed Abu Rumman. I am from Al-Balqa Applied University. My question goes for Professor Indashau. I want to know the current status of plant-based technology and genomics in the context of food security in Africa. What's the involvement of plant-based technology in food security, the current status? Thank you.
Excellent. Next, here. Madam?
I'm Snezhina
introduce yourself.
Independent consultant from Serbia. I have impression, actually, it is a sort of recommendation when we talk about when we talk about food security, that we should better highlight the concept of food safety. Indeed, it is within this concept and within nutrition, but we should better clarify this aspect.
Important point. Let me come to you.
Thank you so much. My name is Zakaria Fatawzi. I am professor in the Agriculture and the Biological Division in National Research Center. I am from Egypt. Above all, I would like to thank the moderator and all speakers today for the important session about food security. Actually, for the most of the presentations, the same situations in Latin America and Africa and other things. My question is, because the food security and the climate change nowadays and in the future is a serious problem. And almost all speakers talk about science, innovation, scientific research for the agriculture sector, for food security. My question is, how to do that? Or is there other questions? What should we do to do that together? Thank you.
Hi, I'm a junior research fellow at Oxford University, Amr. My question, I was very interested to hear the kind of addressing and identifying challenges at a policy level. And my question is to the basic scientists, and there's a few mentions of basic science, to the everyday role of the basic scientist who, you know, concluding in a paper, and this has implications for food security. How do we get from there to actually influencing top-level policy, and how might we streamline that process if there's a strategy? Thanks.
Yes, I'm Jim Welch. I'm the Executive Director of the Elizabeth R. Griffin Foundation in the United States. I noticed an omission from the presentations of any references to livestock diseases or animal diseases. Is that because the impact is negligible, or that's part of something else?
Thank you for pointing out that gap, please.
My name is Zeki Kaya. I'm a plant geneticist. My name is Zeki Kaya. I'm a plant geneticist from Middle East Technical University of Ankara. I'd like to thank the speakers. They highlighted some of the important areas, but I think one area is missing. I was wondering if it's showed up in these regional discussion and reports. There are 500,000 species estimated, plant species in the world. We identified only 250,000. There are still lot of species unidentified, and climate change and land degradation, all kind of disturbances, we will be losing most of the species which could be domesticated later. We have very limited number of crops that the professor just said, 14 species make up all our calories we consume daily. They are very limited. If you go to those species, wheat, barley, rice, these modern varieties have very narrow genetic basis. Forecasted changes in climate or the other disturbance, we will lose these crops. So I was wondering, in situ conservation of wild relatives of crops, did ever come up in these discussions?
And Ashao, you will take this up in the response session.
Hi, my name is Marta from Portugal. I think one of the things that hasn't been spoken too much is the role of industry in this topic. And industry more and more is on the push of what farmers are growing because they need to sell their products. So the industry is very much making decisions on what farmers should be growing. And I won't question if this is correct or not in this forum, but to what extent should we be addressing industry as helpers in this process? If we can see, for example, a great success of the International Year of Pulses 2016, we've just analyzed how many more new food products are being produced in Europe, and as a consequence of YAP 2016, and there have been increases of 200% in certain countries on foods with legume-based products instead of animal-based products. So there is a need, I think, to incorporate.
Dr. Rahana Al-Ghazawi from Jordan Standard and Metrology Organization. I'm basically a food technologist. We have been taught that food have to be treated as an industry to have enough food and to supply food that can get enough for everybody. Now we are talking about sustainability. Is there a contradiction between the two concepts, agriculture dealt as industry and where you are put an objective to have a lot of food to have enough for everybody, and sustainability, environmental conservation and ecological concepts? Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Sasha Kagansky from Global Young Academy in Russia. I wanted to ask, is there a big role for cultivation of algae and other organisms that could be superfoods of the future, especially for the countries with hot and sunny conditions? Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid we have to come to a close. Sorry, I bypassed you. A minute.
Andrei Simončić, Agricultural Institute of Slovenia, and also the Management Board of European Food Safety Agency. I would like to ask distinguished guests about their opinion about biotechnology and GMOs. We haven't spoken about this. I know we have spoken a lot in recent years, but what is your thinking about this issue?
Well, let's start in reverse order. And Robin, you get started, please. And pick and choose, but please pick the difficult ones from the audience. Go ahead, please.
Okay, well, allow me to pick and choose. Well, I'll start with the first one, which was food safety. And actually, I want to link that to livestock diseases, which was also picked up. I mean, of course, there are many aspects of food safety, and in the European report, for example, I mean, we go into mycotoxins, and I know the African report does as well, and that will be sort of familiar to you, that there are implications, for example, for climate change and new marine toxins. So we do address these issues, but the point I wanted to make about food safety is that one critical issue for many of us around the world is the problem of antimicrobial resistance that develops in part because of the excessive use of antibiotics in livestock, whether or not there's an infection. So there are issues there for better evidence base to use antibiotics when appropriate in livestock, policy issues to manage it and regulate that, perhaps not use the antibiotics of most importance to human medicine, and of course bringing it to the science agenda to breed livestock that may be resistant to some of these diseases. So I picked that one up. The other one perhaps I can pick and choose is with regard to basic science and how what one sees that converted into applications and the policy issues. And of course we're actually living through a great example of how basic science is transforming agriculture and many other fields of important societal applications, and that's genome editing, particularly the advent of CRISPR-Cas. That has significant implications in all probability for improved breeding of plants and animals. But of course that was not appreciated when CRISPR was first discovered, 2012 or before that, other genome editing tools, which is why it's so important to invest and support basic research as basic research. And then when the potential begins to be revealed, to think about the consequences downstream with regard to applications and the policy implications. And that's something that we are actively engaged in on genome editing, as some of you will know in the audience, whether that's with regard to plant breeding or the safety and security aspects, for example.
Would you take two?
Yes, you know, just a further comment on the safety comments that were made. Obviously, conventional safety of food is absolutely important going forward in terms of a safe, secure food supply. But I talked about more and better food, and that term better implies food safety. And I think one of the greatest aspects of food safety currently is the consumption of poorly balanced diets leading to obesity and metabolic syndrome. And we don't normally think of that in the context of safety. On the point about algae production, and there's many other forms, insect production, all these sorts of things, I think we need research in those areas. I think they do offer potential, but I also issue a note of caution. And recent work that has just come out of Wageningen University in the Netherlands shows that a lot of insect production is very unsustainable in terms of the dietary footprint, in terms of carbon emissions. So, you know, once again, we need to approach all of these problems from a science perspective. We need to have our conclusions need to be evidence-based, they need to be informed. A lot of these areas sound appealing, they seem to be the elixir for the problem, but I really do think we need to look at the key areas that are important currently and for the future in terms of sustainable food production and put our efforts into those. And that's why the sort of inter-academy approach is very powerful. An cross-national approach where we can go to policymakers with a informed science lobby at the highest order to inform that policy. And I think to be listened to and to get some of these ideas to come through. So I think that was a very good point that came from over here. Final point I make is about the plant-animal debate, and we could be here all afternoon talking about it, but I just say once again, caution, it's very complex. And it's not as simple as to say plant is more efficient than animal, we should have more plant. That's a common thinking, it's completely erroneous. Most of the world's surface area is suitable only for grazing animals, not for rearing soybean and wheat and cereals and plants. And in those cases, a very, very low value commodity is turned into an extremely nutritious, high value commodity with a very, very high biological efficiency. So we need to be very, very, very careful and come up with a balanced argument to what will suit different cultures, different regions of the world.
Gerard?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the interesting questions. Let me say that the plan was to summarize in 8 minutes the work of 2 years. So there are a lot of issues that I didn't include in my presentation, but there are topics in the country studies. For example, food safety is in our study. There is specific policies about climate change and agriculture. There is also animal disease is also in the reports. Also crops that are missing. Let me just to finish say that how to reach the policy makers will be the next stage of the YAP project. That's a very important stage, not only to reach the policy makers, but also to reach the general society. Let me finish saying that we also consider the industry problem. We have a lot of problems with the market power of some industries. For example, the dairy sector is a very clear case in the case of Latin America, where the industry has a lot of market power and it doesn't help to the small producers of dairy products. So that's also in the reports. Thank you.
Okay, Indasha?
I will only emphasize those questions that were directed to me and probably give also some hint to the other questions that were raised. I think the first question was on the position of plant biotechnology genomics in the African setting. And the GMOs, definitely South Africa is the lead in terms of promoting genomics and GMOs. And at the continental level also through NEPAD initiative, biotechnology has been taken very seriously. And BECA, which is in Nairobi, was constructed in order to do genomics and sequences. Many countries in Africa have adopted a policy on biotechnology. But the problem is in terms of infrastructure, manpower, and what have you, that needs to be further seen. Secondly, food safety. I think when we talk about food safety, we also have to consider societal food safety and a personal food safety. Because there is, just like personalized medicine, there is a personalized food also. For example, if we take the pastoralist society, there are lactose tolerance in terms, so they can feed themselves with milk. But there are different societies also that are lactose sensitive. And therefore the food safety issue has to be widened, particularly in terms of domestication processes of the underutilized crops. Because the food that we are eating now is of course a normal food that has gone through many evolutions and selection. So the underutilized crops definitely have to be looked in terms of biosafety. We dealt with that actually in our document that will be seen in the future. What we can do together, my Egyptian colleagues raised, and of course we can do a lot, but the way we can do a lot is through already existing structures. We have got different academies in different countries. We have got regional representations, and I think already there are activities also that are being performed, and so so through those structures, it is much easier actually to be connected. Of course, personally, we can be connected. There is no difficulty there. Then basic sciences.
You need to come to close.
Yeah, basic sciences in African setting. What is basic and what is not basic? What is applied? The importance of basic sciences is a bit mixed up. Because of the problem we deal with application of sciences. But unfortunately, application of sciences can only be pronounced when basic sciences get much stronger entertainment. So I think this is a continental and a country policy issues that we all should take into. Then the conservation issues, the 7,000 plants that are used, the 2,000 plants that exist in Africa, the underutilized that need to be promoted, they have to be protected, they have to be characterized, they have to be conserved in terms of gene bank issues, because those are plants actually that give hidden harvest for hidden hunger. African food security is not mainly considered through larger commodities. In fact, it is these underutilized crops that always protect, because they mitigate actually the environment and the climate change.
Okay.
And I think these are extremely very important. Cultivation of algae, no, that is
let's cut it
important.
here.
Important.
And let's cut it here, really.
Yeah, but I'm not a marine biologist, so
yeah.
I cannot answer that.
Well, thank you very much. We apparently need to let people go to their lunch. Let me underline, this was World Science Forum at its best. We really covered the globe. That has its challenges. You brought some very important points forward from the audience. We will absorb them. The food safety issue, I think, was nicely reflected on. The whole issue of animal production, plant-based proteins, is a big science agenda item. But in moving forward, we, I think, have also touched upon how to collaborate better and to share science between hemispheres, and even taking a geographical, territorial approach across the world, so that relevant science is applied to relevant areas. The nation states are not the only useful unit of observation. Thank you all very much. I ask for a round of applause to our splendid panelists.